joining us. Robbie, you wanted to talk about release cadence.
Yeah, so there's not too many people here today, but we'll pull the people that are here, and then maybe I'll file an issue and see if we can get more people to give us some information. What I'm looking for is I'm curious, sort of what drives people to pick up a new release, right? So do people upgrade every time there's a new release out? Do people wait for a specific feature? Do people upgrade every other version? Do they say like, I'm going to be sort of out of support, quote unquote, if you will, with the community if I'm not on the latest? Like, I'm just kind of curious for people who are here and willing to share, like, what prompts you to grab a new release, right? And in context, our next release candidate is being cut next Tuesday, right? So here we are on the cusp of another release coming out. Luna, were you raising your hand?
Speaking personally, I can say that we basically never upgrade Agones unless we have to, and something is forcing us. Usually what's forcing us is Agones versions being targeted at a Kubernetes version that goes out of support, meaning that we're upgrading like once or twice a year, maybe, depending on GCP's cadence. The reason for that is that Agones is like one in several dozen of open source things that we use, and keeping all of them up to date would be very, very labor intensive. So we don't. There's a couple that we do keep up to date because they're like public internet connectivity level things that we kind of don't want to go out of date. But stuff like Agones, which is only reachable internally through authenticated APIs, we don't really, unless we need a new feature or Kubernetes version is going unsupported. And it's kind of where we keep it at.
Have there been cases in the past where you have needed a new feature and that has prompted an upgrade? Or have the new features sort of not been enough to prompt an upgrade, and like you get them when you upgrade for other reasons?
They have before when we were looking for something specific. Other than that, not really.
Do you have a memory of like what any of those features were? Like, were there any specific ones that jump out at you of like, oh, there was this one thing that we really, really wanted?
Let me have a look. I'll get back to you on that in a minute.
Okay, cool. Anybody else want to share?
I think for us, it was also kind of feature-based. We saw that there was the new sort of player tracking feature, and we wanted to start trying that out. We haven't really integrated that very deeply yet, but I guess just kind of like that it's there so that we can easily get to it when it is time.
Okay.
Also, I think it also had to do with keeping all of our clusters on the same version of Kubernetes as well, as we were updating other open source projects that we use that were also updating their version of Kubernetes, just to keep them all in sync.
Okay. And I know Luna mentioned like following our sort of guidance recommendation of matching the Agones and Kubernetes versions to like what's actually supported. I know there are definitely people that don't do that because we get bug reports of like, hey, this thing isn't quite working, and we're like, well, what's your setup? And they say I'm running Agones 1.12 on Kubernetes 1.20, and we're like, oh, we haven't tested that. But it sounds like the folks that are here are, when they do move Kubernetes, they pick a version of Agones where we've actually tested against that version of Kubernetes. It sounds like
there's actually an additional reason for that. The reason for that is, at least at Embark, we built an additional. We built a Kubernetes controller on top of Agones, meaning that we're actually importing Agones as a Go library, right? If you try and do that with differing versions of the KDES libraries, then what is in Agones' Go mod, you're in for a very bad time. So we tend to just stick to it for that reason more than the actual operational bugs. Like, it's impossible to get a Kubernetes controller library imported if you're not using the same version of the Kubernetes client libraries that it was. You're just gonna you're going to have a very, very bad time trying. So we just don't.
Okay. So do you have like some extra code that you have in like a fork of the Agones repository that you build off of the same dependencies, or because you guys
No.
could have like a separate project and vendor
That's
the
what we
Kubernetes
have,
119. Yeah, you could vendor the Kubernetes
I mean,
119 libraries, and they
well,
should still work against 118, right?
Yes, but not really, right? Like, you still need to import the client to have access to the custom types that Agones defines if you want to do anything with them.
I
And
see.
it's just too much of a bother to try and do that with client library versions that don't match. You always end up with compilation errors of, oh, the Agones libraries are calling this function which was renamed or no longer exists, or this or that happened to it every time. So
Okay, so I think what you're saying is like you're vendoring Agones so you can get the Agones types, and that effectively forces you into that specific Kubernetes client library version, right?
pretty much. In fact, I checked. Our last upgrade was we want to update the Kubernetes client libraries for a different reason in our large monorepo. The most practical way of doing that is actually just to upgrade Agones, which is a bit silly when you think about it, but that's reality.
Interesting. And it sounds like we were thankfully at least up to a version that you wanted to get to, like we weren't behind what you needed. Cool. All right. I guess the other part of this question for folks, if you're willing to share, is when you do this upgrade. So like now you've decided like, okay, we need a new version of GKE, or we need a new version of Agones because we want new client libraries, even if we're on the same, maybe client library is a bad example, but we need some new feature like player tracking in Agones, even if we're on the same version of GKE. Like, how do you go about doing that upgrade? So we've got a couple of different options written down on our website for ways that we sort of recommend people do upgrades. The first one being create a new cluster, shift traffic over to the new cluster, and the second one being basically drain a cluster, upgrade in place in that cluster, and then restore traffic to that cluster. Do people tend to follow one of those two models, or do you do something like completely different that we should know about and maybe try to document and or support?
In my case, at least, we don't follow those recommendations at all, and we'll update the cluster live and in place. And the reason for that is that if we upgrade Agones and it breaks, that's not going to affect any already allocated game servers. There is really no way that it's going to affect them. At worst, the sidecar will stop working, and well, we don't really care because once we're allocated, we don't really care about what the sidecar has to say anyway. At worst case, it means that a cluster might not be able to spawn new game servers, in which case we end up in the same situation as if we had drained the cluster in the first place, right? We have one less cluster taking traffic. We've had very little downsides doing it that way. If we were ever to hit issues, we'd probably revert to draining a cluster entirely before upgrading.
Okay, and you said you generally tend to upgrade Agones when you're upgrading Kubernetes. Does that mean you're doing like the Kubernetes upgrade in place and then the Agones upgrade in place, sort of in that order or in the opposite order? Like you're not creating new clusters, you're taking your existing cluster and moving it to the new state, it sounds like.
Yeah, if we also need to upgrade a version of Kubernetes, we're actually going to drain the cluster first, because bad times with CRDs meant for different versions of Kubernetes and all of those shenanigans, we try and not have to deal with that.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So it sounds like you're not generally, creating new clusters very, very frequently. You have sort of a static set of clusters, and when you're moving to new versions of the software, you update those clusters in place. But adding new clusters would be more of like a capacity planning thing of like, we need a cluster in this geo, or we need more capacity overall. That would prompt creating a new cluster, but the typical upgrade process for all of your software doesn't include creating new clusters.
That's correct.
Okay.
Do you do that with like a maintenance window, or like, hey, stop testing now, or depending on where you are with your development cycle?
Neither. When we're just doing an Agones version upgrade, the way we have our setup is that every region has more than one cluster. Meaning that if we upgrade a cluster in place and it fails and we can't accept traffic in that cluster anymore, our software will automatically just use the other cluster. The way it's implemented is our matchmaker, when it requests servers, will actually just pick a random game server cluster to ask for the allocation. If it doesn't work, I'll try again a few seconds later in another one. Again, pick that random. So if a cluster is down and doesn't let you allocate anything, well, we'll just all go to the other one at the end, maybe with a few seconds of delay, but we're fine with that. Mind you, if we ever ran into issues with this approach, which is kind of very Wild Westy, we'd probably just drain the cluster in advance. Like, we just haven't had issues doing it this way. So we're like, hey, why not? It saves us a bunch of time.
Right. So presumably you're using Helm then for both install and upgrade, because if you use the YAML install or another method, you're kind of stuck, right?
We use some Bazel tooling, but they're running Helm and then applying some patches with Customize at the end of the day. So yeah.
Cool. Sean, do you have anything you want to share about how you guys do like upgrades when you want to pick up a new Agones version?
Yeah, so we're not like a live service right now. So we haven't really had to work through that. But it does sound like if we wanted to make sure there was like a zero downtime upgrade, we would create a new cluster and we'd stand up Agones in there and game servers in there, and then like register it with our matchmaking, and then unregister like the original cluster, and then people would start going to the new one, and we just wait for the old one to drain. Unless upgrade in place worked well, then we would try that first. And like I think was saying, if it works, then that's great. If not, you can just wait for the people to drain out of there and just do what I was saying before.
Yeah, I think the thing about upgrade in place is that it theoretically should work okay. We just don't really test it to convince ourselves that it always is working okay. And we do occasionally have PRs that we mark as kind breaking, and sometimes kind breaking PR might break an in-place upgrade. Like our EDE test cluster, we effectively are doing in-place upgrades all the time on every PR when we're doing tests. But occasionally it gets wedged and we have to go fix it. And so that's the sort of thing that if we said in-place upgrades are a recommended way to upgrade, like we support it, that we would need to have some more sort of test infrastructure in place to convince ourselves that that does in fact sort of always work, right? Like right now, I think it generally works, but we aren't like, confident enough to tell folks that that is sort of a way we recommend doing it. If that makes sense.
A question on that: when your end-to-end cluster breaks, do you mean the Agones controller itself breaks, or do allocated game servers break? Because that's a big difference, right? Like, if the Agones controller breaks, well, you effectively are back to, like Sound said, you're just back to doing a new cluster effectively, right? And you're draining. And yeah, but if allocated game servers break, that's a much bigger problem.
Right, and this is a place where we don't have the test coverage for recommending in-place updates, because when we update the software, it's sort of between test runs. So we do a test run, it finishes, then we do an upgrade, then we do a test run. And if we did want to say in-place upgrades work, we would want to test the way you're describing, which is we are upgrading during tests, right? We actually have things allocated. We verify that they keep working while we're doing an upgrade, while an upgrade breaks, right? So we don't have any tests that actually do that. The upgrade happens between tests. And so what'll happen is we do an upgrade. I think generally what happens is Helm kind of gets wedged and like doesn't complete, or like I've seen Helm like occasionally like not install all the CRDs somehow. Like it'll like miss a CRD and then the controller will crash loop, right? And so you'll get a cluster where you can't run the test successfully. The tests just keep failing because like the Agones system isn't set up properly, like the controller's crash looping or the CRDs aren't there or something's misconfigured, right? And so that's what I've seen in our EDE test cluster.
Does that mean you're still running Helm 1 then for your end-to-end test with an actual Helm controller in your cluster, as opposed to, well, the latest versions of Helm don't have that anymore, right? It's just a template that you apply.
Yeah, no, it's Helm 3, but it still kind of gets wedged because the template, like it's still running Helm on the client side and like actuating like the template that you apply, and I don't know how it happens, but I've definitely seen Helm.
I can tell you.
Screw up. Do you know how Helm gets screwed up?
Yeah, apparently for reasons I don't understand, the bug gets fixed in like Kubernetes 1.2.0 or 1.20. I don't quite understand, but like because we included now like a lot more validation in the CRDs. When the CRDs change, Helm can't do upgrades. It just goes, no, can't do it. It doesn't work. And so apparently it's been fixed in Kubernetes. So if that happens, it gets wedged in that you can't. I think it stops upgrading and it's still there and works. Like Agones itself works, but like you can't upgrade it at that point. You actually have to delete the whole Helm install and then reapply the whole thing again because it just hates you.
Yeah, on that note, we've had similar issues. So for context, we don't actually run Helm against our cluster. We run Helm template, which gives us a YAML file. We then run customize on that, which lets us patch things as we want. And we do a kubectl apply of that in our cluster. That can fail for the same aforementioned reasons of CRDs not matching or a bunch of other things. And if you get to that state, you're in for a bad time if you want to do an in-place upgrade, because you'd have to delete and reapply, right? And what happens when you delete a CRD? It deletes all the things that are applied of that type, meaning you're deleting all your game servers.
Right.
So that's a very dangerous one if you're trying to do in place. Big red letters, don't delete the CRDs under any circumstance, or you will crash a bunch of games.
Yeah, so in our ADE tests, we don't have that problem because when it's in this sort of broken state, any new test that starts ends up failing. And so we just delete the CRDs, uninstall with Helm, reinstall with Helm, and then the next test run succeeds, right? So it's not, this is where I'm saying, like, for us to sort of advertise or advocate for an in-place upgrade, and me to be comfortable with that, I'd want to be running tests that like sort of have like a sort of simulated game running during the upgrade, and we verify that we don't, under any circumstance, like you say, remove allocated game servers no matter what breaks in the upgrade process. Right?
Yeah, and in my experience, when you start going down that route, you stand up needing to write your own CTL tool. I'm just going to refer to prior art here of Istio CTL and a bunch of others that do exactly that. Like, just relying on kubectl or Helm to do its thing is not going to be good enough to recover from various failure scenarios, right? Which might just be, we don't want to do this, end of story, which is a very, very fair thing.
Well, that's sort of that's how our stance has been so far, is we don't want to do that because it's a lot of complexity for maybe not a huge game, I think, at this point. Like, because we're not hearing a lot of people saying like, this is the only way we upgrade, it has to work 100% of the time, et cetera, right? Because you guys are doing an upgrade this way, but as you said, like, it's okay if it breaks because you do have a redundant cluster, and for the most part it doesn't, and you don't upgrade that often, so it's not a huge pain point, right? So I think this is sort of the discussion. I mean, so sort of from there to pivot onto the second thing that I wanted to ask is, our release cadence right now is the same release cadence we've had for a really long time, ever since I started working on the project, which is every 6 weeks, sort of like clockwork, we cut a release, regardless of how many PRs have merged, how many issues have been closed, like what's gone into the repository in the last 6 weeks. So we're constantly creating new release numbers. Sometimes those releases, pick up a new Kubernetes version. Sometimes they add other new features, like they'll add the alpha player tracking features. And sometimes, like, not a whole lot honestly changed, like especially the releases we cut near the winter holidays. Like sometimes there'll be a release where it's like, yep, it's kind of like the old one, but we're sticking to our release schedule, right? So sort of given what people have said about updates, I'm curious how people would feel about us changing our release cadence. And there are two ways we can do that. One is we can just reduce the frequency. So we can say, instead of every 6 weeks, we'll do every 10 weeks, 12 weeks, like pick a different number that's bigger. And the other is we could move to feature-based releases, where we cut releases sort of more on demand when like there is something that is worth cutting release for. So that could be, we've decided it's time to upgrade Kubernetes. Like that's generally a point where we want to cut a new release. It's, we have a new feature like player tracking that's in alpha and we want people to use it, so we'd cut a new release. And the release cadence, if you will, at that point would be unpredictable. It wouldn't be every 6 weeks, every 12 weeks, every N amount of time. It would be based on, we've accumulated enough stuff that it's time to cut a new release. And I know that April Open Match kind of moved to this model after they hit 1.0, where they said we were cutting releases about every month. We hit 1.0, we don't have a lot of new stuff we're adding in, so let's just cut releases when we need to, right? And then we won't incur the overhead of constantly cutting releases and asking people to upgrade to them. So I'm curious if people have thoughts about either of those two models, like either status quo, reduce the cadence, or move to sort of feature-based releases.
I actually have a counter suggestion, and I think you're in a very different scenario from Agones. Sorry, from Open Match. because Agones is a Kubernetes controller and OpenMatch is not. I refer back to my earlier problem of Kubernetes client libraries. My counter suggestion is actually keep it every 6 weeks because it's super convenient. If you need something against updated Kubernetes client libraries, well, just pick the latest one. It's probably going to be the right version, and you're never in a situation where, oh, there hasn't been any releases for 3 months because there have been no new features, but I do need my new client libraries, please. So my suggestion is keep cutting it every 6 weeks, but if there is no notable features, make it a point release instead of a major release. So if 6 weeks from now there is no new features, instead of cutting, well, you're about to cut what, 1.12, I think, and
no,
like
15.
No, 1.15.
15.
Like, let's say in 6 weeks, if there's no new features, instead of cutting 160, you'd cut 1.15.1 to make clear that, hey, there's not that much new. And that might be a better way to make it nice to keep people up to date with client libraries and Kubernetes versions in general.
That's an interesting point. Like, because I look at like the difference between some of our versions, we didn't do it this time because our next point on the agenda, we weren't quite ready to go to 119 for this release. But we had been sort of every other version picking up a new Kubernetes client libraries, a new Kubernetes version. But the alternating releases, unless somebody like Mark added player tracking, like there was often not a whole lot in sort of the other ones. And so if we'd adopted that model, we might have had 1.13, and instead of 1.14, we might have had 1.13.1, and then we might have had 1.14 where we upgraded Kubernetes, and then 1.14.1, right? Which I think, to your point, Luna, might have signified not a lot has changed in this one. So I think that the other thing that sort of plays into this discussion is if you look at like our feature promotion process and our feature gates, the way that those get promoted is something like about
Did Robert just disappear for anyone else?
Okay.
No more Robbie. He usually comes back when his internet glitches. Hard fail.
Broke it. Okay, well, while he's rebooting, possibly. Thank you all for attending today. You all get swag. So I will send you codes. Alex, I don't know if yours ever actually arrived from OpenMatch, but hopefully it's a good sign that we haven't received like we can't find this person or country. Robbie doesn't get swag though because he had internet problems. So sorry.
Sorry, my upstream bandwidth has been flaky lately. That happens where I can hear you guys, but you can't hear me. So I think what I was trying to say is, the other thing to consider is our feature promotion process with feature gates, where we will take a feature, we'll turn it off by default, but add it to a version. Like with player tracking, it's off by default, but you can turn it on with feature gate. At some point, we promote it to being on by default, but able to turn it off. And then at some point, we turn it to it's always on. And so we'd have to decide if when we have new features like that, presumably when we're promoting something to this beta, like it's on, but you can turn it off, like that should, for a significant feature, be enough to warrant a release cut, even if we're not doing something like, picking up a new Kubernetes version, because that's a sort of a bigger behavioral change, right? We have to decide if it's a new thing that's off by default, like with player tracking going to alpha, would that have been enough to warrant updating the minor number or just the point number, right? So because it's not changing the default behavior, it's like a new thing you could do, but it's not there. It's going to happen to you whether if you do nothing, right?
So in my opinion, a minor release version should signify this is very safe to update. Go ahead. So in that light, since you're not changing default behavior, I would say minor. On the other hand, that makes it harder to promote. I realize that. So in that light, maybe major. But yeah, that's an interesting debate.
I get Robbie, as a more general question, what problem are we trying to solve with release cadence changes here? Is it a communication issue? Is it a resourcing issue? What are we trying to optimize for?
Yeah, so I'm trying to sort of get a sense for like how much the first question was really along the lines of, if we're cutting releases every 6 weeks and nobody's adopting them, like sort of what's the point, right? Of should we be cutting releases at a cadence that is more aligned with like when people pick them up? Because if, you know, say we cut 115 and nobody ever uses it, like, was it worthwhile to spend the time cutting 115, right? So I think part of the question is like, if everybody upgrades twice a year, should we be cutting releases at this fast of a cadence? Or should we be, like, a monthly release would probably still be fast enough to pick it up twice a year and still get something pretty recent, monthly, like bi-monthly, right? So I think that was part of the first question. And it goes back to, it's sort of a question about toil on both ends. It's a question of toil of creating the releases, takes some time. If, you know, when we're writing release notes, we're like, wow, there's really nothing to write for this release. Like, how do I say I'm excited that I'm cutting a new release when nothing has really changed, right? Like, again, that goes back to like, is there a point to having cut that release? Or should we be waiting for something that we can say, this is why you should use this release? Because I think what I've heard from a couple of people is sometimes there's a feature that's worth upgrading for, right? Like, I need a new version of Kubernetes client libraries, or I want player tracking, or I want X, right? And in those cases, the release notes can be like, hey, with this release, here's this new thing you can do, or this new thing you get that might tempt you to upgrade. And the other reason people upgrade is sort of like just the maintenance of like, it's been a while, it's time to upgrade. And then you'd probably generally just pick sort of the latest one that works for you, right? So I think it's on both sides. Is how often do people upgrade? How hard is it to upgrade? Do we need to make upgrading easier or different in some way? And then if people aren't upgrading very frequently, is it still worthwhile to be cutting releases frequently? So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
The other question I would ask is, if we're slowing down release cadence, does that mean we might, I mean, that would have to mean that we're more willing to cut hot fixes?
Yes.
Which means that there's more onus to be on top of what could, or what may or may not be a hot fix or is a requirement. Like, I look at like the recent bug that your PR that's going through, right? Like, it's a really small thing, like changing the HTTP status code for when a game server allocation happens to 201, which for a lot of people is no problem, but for C# users apparently is a big problem. Is that hot fixable? Is that hot fix worthy? For some of our people who are using it, yes, that'll be a big change that makes a difference. If we do every 6 weeks, then we don't have to worry about that. Yep. Because we do it every 6 weeks and it makes life easy. For that very reason. By the same token, does that mean then we also, like, we may not even be hot fixing at that point? Do we need to backport because maybe we're in a weird interim state? And like, how do we handle that? Because we don't do that now for that other reason as well, and that sounds icky.
Yes, and that's the other sort of follow-up question is, if the consensus was slow things down, what are the follow-on effects from that? And I think the two you just mentioned are the most important, which is right now we basically say, you know, unless it's a real emergency, we're not going to cut 20 releases. We always just wait 6 weeks, and that's soon enough, you know, unless something is really, really critical. Yeah. I think looking back at the release history, there's been like one time so far that we've cut a release in between 6 releases. Right? But for the most part, we say, you know, with the C# bug, it's like, oh, that sounds like a kind of annoying, pretty bad bug. It'll be fixed within a couple weeks, right? Like, there will be a new release for you within a couple weeks, even if, you know, Luna doesn't care about it and doesn't pick it up, or Sean doesn't care about it and pick it up. Like, it'll be there for those people, right? So I think that's the advantage of having the faster release cadence, right? I don't know. I guess I'm trying to like step back and look holistically. Like, I think the quick release cadence makes a whole lot of sense pre 1.0, because you're constantly changing things, you're constantly adding features, and I think you're asking people to upgrade really quickly to pick up the latest things. Like, hey, we're trying to figure out if this is stable, we're trying to figure out if this new thing worked, etc. I think post 1.0, generally I've seen like the velocity of new features being added slow down, because we've sort of hit that point where what's there tends to work, right? Like Luna's saying, like, we don't upgrade unless we kind of need to for some reason, right? And occasionally there'll be a feature that's worthy of an upgrade, but generally it's sort of more of a maintenance upgrade. And so in that sort of steady state, does the same release cadence make sense? And the answer might be yes. I'm not trying to say we should change it. I'm just trying to gather some information about, like, is what we're doing still make sense given that we're post 1.0 and the feature velocity has slowed down quite a bit. So I think I will open a GitHub issue and kind of try to put some of the summary stuff in there and try to get some opinions from people that don't happen to be here today. I'm not suggesting we change something right now. But I do want to kind of have this conversation, maybe if different people show up to the next meeting, like maybe 1 or 2 more times, and then try to come to a consensus on whether we keep the status quo or change something up.
That makes sense. There's probably another side to this coin, which is there ways we can reduce toil in the release process as it currently stands?
Yes.
Because if we can make that less onerous as well, then that also makes it. Then it also becomes a different, less of an issue that way too. But that may not be possible. Maybe it's just the way it is.
Another possible solution. Well, solution is a weird word here, but like another possible thing that is doable, and that's only if that is easy to do from the Agones side, is have different versions of this custom types built against different versions of the client library, right? Like, if I had 4 versions to pick there against, then that would be a lot more comfortable for me, right? I would just pick, whatever version of Kubernetes am I running everywhere else, I'll use that. And on the Agones side, I don't think it's very hard. It's just running the generator 3 times instead of once, right? And then
we have to
put that in the folder.
It.
You have to test it. That's true, but that's automated as far as I understood it, right?
Well, we test against one end-to-end cluster is what we do now.
Yeah, then you would need multiple ones. That's true.
Multiple. Yeah, it's the maintenance burden. And we need to have multiple builds, and it makes my head hurt.
It's a different type of work, right? It's changing up how we do testing to get a different advantage, right? So definitely something to consider along the spectrum of like, again, do we keep the status quo or do we decide that the status quo is no longer serving us, right?
Yeah, like the reason I suggest it because at that point you can very easily motivate. We just got feature releases because, well, all 3 last versions of Kubernetes run against 120, 119, and 1.18, for example. So that's clearly going to work for everyone. It also means you're no longer tied to whatever version of Kubernetes happens to run at all cloud providers, which would be very nice, personally speaking, as a not only Amazon user.
I think that means, Mark, you wouldn't have to look up whatever version of EKS Kubernetes is, or what Kubernetes version EKS is using. Like, we always have to look up.
They're better about that website stuff now, I noticed.
The reason I also bring this up is very old Kubernetes versions are a thing, and very new ones are also. And sometimes it's nice to be able to, like, for example, let's say Kubernetes 1.21 comes out, and we have the feature we're really excited about. Well, we can't use it until Agones upgrades, which is like going to be 2 years from now, because that's when Amazon is going to update it to it, right? So that's a nice added advantage of that approach.
By the way, is there a way just to document the approach to generate Agones for a previous version of +1 or -2? Sorry. Maybe we can just document and say follow these steps.
Can you say that one more time?
Hopefully. I mean, probably we can document how you can use with previous version, for example, how you can regenerate or release your own Agones.
I see what you're saying. Like you could take the source code and create your own release that was targeting a specific older or newer version at that point. I think the downside of that is that then puts the onus on the person who does that to like go do that process and then test it to make sure it actually works. And if they tell us it doesn't work, unlikely to want to spend our time helping them, right? But it certainly would be possible, right, if somebody cared enough, right?
What I'm hoping is, like, I'm happy, like, I don't necessarily want older versions of Kubernetes, right? I want newer ones because Agones is quite far behind as far as versions go because of EKS largely. It'd be great if I had whatever EKS has and every version following that supported rather than only whatever EKS had.
So the policy isn't, wait for EKS, right? We changed the policy that we didn't have to wait for everyone, but we do have to wait for 2 of the 3. This kind of is a good segue to our next agenda item since we only have 15 minutes left. which is that a few weeks ago I checked all of the versions as we were starting the process for the current release cycle, and not enough of the providers supported 1.19 for us to start doing the upgrade. I think Mark put a comment in a PR recently that we are now at that state where 2 of the 3 do support 1.19 as the N-1 version. And we could start the upgrade, but it was too close to our next release cut for me to have confidence that we'd finish it in time. And so the current plan is for us to do it sort of right after this release gets cut as part of the, if we keep our current numbering scheme, 1.16 release. So I just wanted to give people sort of a heads up here that that is the current plan. So Mark, I'm assuming when you put that comment in the PR that you actually had sort of checked the different providers.
Triple checking now and writing them in the notes.
Okay, cool.
There you go. There's Rapid. There's that, and then AKS. Here we go. I thought AKS actually was displaying it. I saw it. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I checked on May 10th at GKE. On May 10th, GKE supported 16, 17, 18, 19, fall version 17. We were already supporting it. And so I was waiting for GKE to do that one. So it would be -1. AKS was over there. And we'd have 2 or 3.
Daily
So you have.
It's fine. I'm actually gonna see if it'll let me run the command.
So GKE does have 120 now.
Yeah, it's in Rapid.
It's in Rapid. I guess that do we count Rapid for?
But I'm also I'm just looking at the AKS release calendar. They had 1.20 in GA in March of this year, at least according to their release calendar. I'm just looking at.
Yep.
I just want to confirm that they usually have release notes somewhere. According to their release calendar, they should be in May, June. Yeah, they should be covering 18, 19, and 20 at this point.
Okay.
Can never get the actual command thing to run. It's very annoying.
I always end up having to run it like in a Docker container somewhere because I can't get it to run on my computer.
I've been trying to run it in like the web thing, and it doesn't like my login credentials for whatever reason.
Yeah, I've never gotten the web thing. Like their version of Cloud Shell, I've never gotten that to work properly.
Yeah.
So, okay, but I think, depending on what you find, and I'll go check again also. But I think we are on track at this point to move to 1.19 for the next release. So again, kind of back to the previous conversation about release cadence, if you're really hoping for 1.19, like, it's only 6 weeks away, right? Because we cut releases every 6 weeks, which is, kind of a nice to know it's that soon, right? If it's something you're concerned about.
To cut back to the earlier point, if I was really excited about a 1.20, I would be like, I have no idea how long I have to wait, right?
Yes, I mean, I think we can kind of play it out. GKE did eventually, or recently, not eventually, but recently post release schedule with anticipated release dates, and so GKE says that 1.21 will be available on the Rapid channel in June of this year, and so I think AKS has the last couple times I've checked has been ahead of GKE. Which means that as of June this year, which is also coming up really soon, 1.20 might be a possible target. So we may end up, the way the calendar works out, end up doing 1.19 in our next Agones release and 1.20 in the following one. So it may not actually be that far away. Yeah, Mark just posted the AKS one in there. Yeah, AKS I think AKS is definitely ahead at the moment. I'll post a link to the GKE release schedule, which is
Oh, yeah,
a new thing that they pointed us at, which is really cool because that was definitely never something that
that's
we
super
saw
nice.
before. Cool. All right, that was the end of the 2 things that I put on the agenda, which have taken up most of our hour today. Mark, do you want to move over to your
My apology.
apologetic agenda item?
That's all it is. It's literally it. Sorry for being slow on the things I'm working on. There's some other stuff that I've needed to work on, and it's taken my focus away for a bit. But I do want to complete those things. I know they're important to people, so that's literally it. I'm just apologizing.
Do you have any? I know we've talked in the past, like you said, that player tracking was kind of close to. And then Dom had some comments on the API surface. Do you have any updates on where we're at on that? Is that one of the things that still needs some work? Are we? I mean, 'cause I opened the tracking issue at 1677, and then was like, "Oh, that's really long. I'll read that later." So I have no clue about where we're at right now.
Yeah. So it seems like people using it seem reasonably happy. There was an unfortunate case of wrote the thing, then people came and said, "Hey, could you refactor it so it's better this way?" And I went, "That I really wish that would have happened in the first place, but it didn't, so that's fine." I started doing some of the design work on that, but have since sort of put it behind to focus on the advanced allocation stuff because we don't actually need the refactoring stuff for the advanced allocation stuff to work.
Okay.
So if somebody else wants to take that up and sort of push that through, that'd be awesome. They can continue the work that I've been doing there. What was I going to say? In fact, I think I have some of it committed in a branch somewhere too. Yeah, that's kind of where I was at. I was going to try and get some of the advanced allocation stuff in an alpha state so people could play with that and get that working, and then come back around to the player tracking and start to try and push that through. But yeah, those 2 are not actually blocked by each other in any way, shape, or form.
Cool. So I guess the TLDR from that is if you do have comments on the design, you haven't actually done the work to change it yet. So now you could time to put their comments in. We don't have to do this. So we'd like to update it on the current sort of suggestions to refactor and hopefully lock it in there and promote it up to being on by default on the data part of the release gates.
Yeah.
Pretty soon after that, right? Like
It's
whenever that work
literally,
lands, pretty soon after that, we'd like to push it for beta. Because it's been sitting there for quite a while in alpha, and it sounds like for the most part people are happy with it, but we want to tweak the API. So having tweaked the API, people are okay with that. Like functionality wise, it seems like we're going to want to promote it pretty quickly.
Yeah, the SDK shouldn't actually change from like the engine integration side. It's literally just like the gRPC and REST underlying surface, which will break some stuff along the way. But we're like, you should follow the Google guides for how we do this, and I'm like, yes, we should, but we didn't. Because I'm bad at that stuff.
I have a question on that. Mark, does that mean that this affects the Agones sidecar talking to the game itself, right? Does that mean that you effectively have to make sure that the client version you're running matches the Agones sidecar version you're running? Otherwise, things will break for player tracking.
Yes.
Is that right?
That is 100% correct. It's an alpha feature. It can break.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's totally fine. We're not using it yet. I just want to make sure that I drill in my mind. Alpha feature means that there's no guaranteed stability yet in the SDK to the sidecar, while a beta feature would have that stability, right?
Beta features technically still can break. That is the thing, but they are less likely to.
Okay, cool.
Right. Yeah. With alpha, it's in development.
Yeah, losing you again. Poor Robbie's.
Poor Rob.
Bandwidth.
The reason to give a bit more insight in why I'm asking this, the way we're running Agones, we don't run a fixed number of fleets. We actually have an extra controller on top, as I mentioned, and we can spawn a fleet for a 6-month-old game server, or we can spawn a fleet for a game server that was built an hour ago. And the way we do that is our matchmaker, when it gets a matchmaking request that comes in, it looks at the build ID, and it then tells the game server clusters, hey, please pin this up for me. This means that we effectively can't guarantee the client SDK version that is running
Right.
in our game server, because, well, it might be the one from 6 months ago, or it might be the one we're adding today, and we actually need all of them to work.
So the good thing about that is the SDK itself won't, for this stuff specifically, won't change. It's the communication layer that runs between the. Actually, no, wait, I lie. I'm lying. No, I'm 100% lying. Never mind. Yes, it will break. I am 100% wrong. Never mind.
Yeah, but it's more for us to know we should avoid alpha features then at all costs, and be very wary of beta features if you run a setup like we are.
Yeah, I think. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so for beta features, like the intent is for them not to change.
Yeah.
But I think we reserve the right to still break them while they're in beta between GA, because that's the first time they get turned on, and we expect more people to interact with them. You know, somebody could say like, oh my God, this is so broken. Our chance. That's sort of our last chance to fix the API before we do lock in and give long-term guarantees. So it's going to be like, expect it to be stable, but there could be cases not. We haven't caught it enough.
I caught most of what you said there. Thanks for clarifying.
All right, well, I think we can call it for this time. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll be back next month. Bye, y'all.
Okay.